Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dave Cotter, and I'm the director of the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And although in keeping with the spirit of the day, I'm actually at a remote location. The Dole Institute and the Department of Military History have enjoyed an association of many years, over a decade, and it is based on the commitment of the Institute, in particular Mr. Bill Lacey, to present a series of talks of interest to the greater University of Kansas community. And the Command and General Staff College has been a willing partner in that effort for all those years. And I'm here today because Angie and Zach were able to overcome the technical challenges involved in remote presentations and enable us to continue our program despite the best efforts of the coronavirus to derail it. At the end of this, if there are any questions on this presentation, and Zach will explain this later on, you can enter a question into the text box, and then he will forward that to me. By way of disclaimer, any problem with this presentation will almost certainly be my fault. As I mentioned, the Dole Institute and the Command and General Staff College, the series is one of very long standing, and each year the program is shaped by a general theme. For 2020, that theme has been turning points in history, and I have the privilege of offering the 5th installment of this year's program, during which I will discuss 1941 as the turning point in the persecution of the Jews of Europe and the beginning of the Holocaust. But before we begin, a note on numbers. Holocaust statistics vary greatly, and they vary between researchers and between source documents, and are oftentimes inexact. I tend to use figures that are essentially at the midpoint. But if one digs into the topic, you may notice disparities between a figure used, for example, by Timothy Snyder, that may differ significantly from one used by Raoul Hilberg, even though talking about this episode event. As to consider this as we proceed. 1941, of course, will have a different meaning for many people. I'm trying to share my screen and it has been disabled. Give me just a moment, please. So 1941 is a turning point. It, of course, has different meanings for different people. For many Americans, 1941 means Pearl Harbor and the sudden entry of the United States into the Second World War. For boxing fans, 1941 was the year that Joe Louis abandoned his bum of the month club schedule and scored a memorable knockout of Billy Conn. 1941 was also the peak and then the end of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against Britain, notably the London Blitz. And 1941 was the year that Orson Welles mystified us with Rosebud in Citizen Kane. Germane to today's discussion, 1941 was also the year that Adolf Hitler abrogated his prior arrangement with Stalin and ordered the Wehrmacht to invade the Soviet Union and launched the Holocaust in the process. That attack, Operation Barbarossa, is itself a turning point. But for today, I will focus on how, coincident with that attack, the program of persecution of the Jews shifted into high gear and launched the Holocaust. This will require some background on the National Socialist rise to power and of Operation Barbarossa itself. Before 1941, National Socialist persecution of the Jewish people was not a program of mass murder. Rather, they and other identified groups were subject to a program of removal, what we would call ethnic cleansing in today's terminology, in order to prevent the pollution of the German people by those lesser beings. The motives for this are many, and they are debatable, but a key energy in this effort was a new brand of anti-Jewishness that was of a more racialist character than the traditional faith-based discrimination. That new anti-Jewishness, described by Saul Friedlander as redemptive anti-Semitism, sought to redeem the German bloodline by eradicating that which would pollute it, notably the Jews. The National Socialists added to this a scientific cant, manifest as the racial eugenics that assigned relative values to peoples, and predictably, the Jews of Europe were at the very bottom of that chain. Almost as a forecast of the future, Hitler's Mein Kampf described his goal of establishing a so-called new order, which would be peopled by racially pure Germans, the Volk. His plan included the elimination of the Jews and others as racial pollutants well in advance of his rise to political power. Hitler also leveraged the scars of the First World War to promote a romantic mythology within the National Socialist Party. The narrative highlighted a so-called Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that had denied the German army of World War I its rightful victory by betraying them on the home front. That betrayal, described as the stab in the back, condemned German Jews, communists, and socialists as traitors. Against the background of that traitorous Judeo-Bolshevik cabal, National Socialism enshrined the noble German people, the Volk, based on Teutonic superiority and racial purity, as embodied in their concept called Aryanism. The Aryan narrative was underpinned by racialism and eugenics, which, in combination, reduced the handicapped, Jews, Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, and others to subhuman status, Untermensch. The Jews were particularly scorned as a racially poisonous plague, and using scientific terminology, were frequently characterized as a social bacillus. The National Socialist anti-Jewish narrative of the German Jews, identified as alien and incessantly vilified, became entrenched over time. When Hitler and the Nazis assumed office in 1933, they moved swiftly and adroitly to gain and consolidate power. Using a remarkable series of events to great advantage, beginning in February of 1933, they used the Reichstag fire, the genesis of which is a matter of significant debate, to suspend significant civil liberties, notably habeas corpus. This allowed the regime to detain perceived enemies without due process. It also enabled the Nazis to silence unwelcome criticism without consequence. Adolf Hitler was mere steps away from absolute dictatorship. Over the ensuing months and years, the National Socialists leveraged the deep respect for the law felt by most Germans to create a legal basis for discrimination. The regime passed a series of laws, including the so-called Nuremberg laws, which enabled the state to discriminate against unwanted groups, to disenfranchise them, to dispossess them of their wealth and property, and ultimately to strip them of citizenship, rendering them stateless and without legal standing or recourse. The Jews of Germany were a specific and particular target of those laws. In 1938, a nationwide anti-Jewish riot, Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, symbolized the utter marginalization of the German Jewish population. As a group, their sovereignty was forfeit. German Jewish efforts to escape the regime intensified, but were frequently frustrated by restrictive immigration laws in other countries, including the United States. In the end, of the roughly 600,000 Jews living in Germany in January of 1933, roughly half of them were able to emigrate before 1941. Less than a year after Kristallnacht, in September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, using mechanized maneuver forces to quickly overwhelm the Polish army. Signally, and perhaps as a portent of things to come, SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, SS Commander Heinrich Himmler's de facto second in command for most state security matters, dispatched 7 special purpose SS units, Einsatzgruppen, to follow the Wehrmacht into Poland. Trailing behind the large formations, their task was to eliminate, by removal and frequently by murder, the Polish intelligentsia and other unwanted people, especially Jews. In the third volume of his trilogy on Nazi Germany, The Third Reich at War, Richard Evans maintains that over 65,000 civilians fell victim to the Einsatzgruppen in Poland. We will hear more about the Einsatzgruppen shortly. What is evident in the short synopsis is the gradual acceleration of persecution from the arrival of the Nazi regime in early 1933, and how they use legal and extra-legal methods to coerce the undesirable groups, again, especially the Jews, to leave Germany, and they even encouraged and enabled that emigration. In addition to the persecution of Germany's Jews, aggressive diplomacy and war, threatened and actual, resulted in the expansion of areas under Nazi influence. As their territories increased, so too did the number of unwanted people in the newly controlled areas. As the map shows, through 1940, the expansion of National Socialist influence was steady and irresistible. They controlled most of Western Europe, but their forward advance had come to a standstill. What to do now? After the fall of France and the escape of most of the British Army, Germany turned its attention and focus to Britain proper. Hitler believed that Germany must defeat the British by attack via cross-channel invasion, so-called Operation Sea Lion, or, if that could not be accomplished, to convince them to come to the negotiating table. Hitler's air commander, Field Marshal Hermann Göring, unleashed the power of the Luftwaffe onto the island nation in order to either compel surrender or set conditions for the follow-on cross-channel attack. Göring waged a nearly year-long bombing campaign, but the Luftwaffe's best efforts failed, largely because of the success of Fighter Command in the Battle of Britain and the staunchness of the British people who resisted the relentless bombing, the Blitz. Unable to force them into surrender, the weakened but still capable British held out and stymied Hitler's plans for a cross-channel attack. Adding urgency to the situation, Germany was feeling the tightening of the Allied noose that was restricting access to the required economic and material resources. The Nazi war machine had an insatiable appetite for fuel, armament, food, and other material requirements. Additionally, the morale of the home front was a top National Socialist priority. The near starvation conditions of the latter days of World War I must be avoided at all costs. Thus, inaction was not an option. Something had to be done to force the issue. But what? The Soviet Union, Hitler's sworn enemy, but with whom he shared an uneasy alliance, lurked to the east. Germany had completed a non-aggression pact in 1939 in order to enable the invasion of Poland without Soviet interference. But as Mein Kampf suggested and subsequent statements made clear, Hitler believed that war with the Soviets was both inevitable and necessary. Hitler's plans for the United States were less concrete, but he believed that America as a nation of racial mongrels would require future attention. But for the time being, America was still far away. For its part, the OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, agreed with the Fuhrer that they must maintain momentum and secure crucial industrial and warfighting resources. But the OKW suggested not a direct attack east or west, but attacks on the periphery, which could accomplish the same end. Hitler was in a quandary what to do, move east or west. The analysis of the situation, at least as viewed by Hitler, held clear answers and a definite way ahead. To the west, Britain was on her knees and comprised little threat, in part because she was strong enough to resist external attack and thus should be bypassed or ignored, at least for the time being. Moreover, the Fuhrer was not enamored with the OKW's strategy of attacking at the edges. To the east, on the other hand, Hitler saw a way to maintain momentum and secure plentiful war-making resources while at the same time attacking the hated communists. He must invade the USSR. As evidenced by the first months in the Winter War in Finland, Hitler believed that the Red Army tended to be disorganized in its initial operations, a condition that could provide a window for success of a quick, decisive attack. Moreover, the Soviet soldiers were subhuman Slavs. Ergo, a quick victory would certainly be possible, especially at the hands of the juggernaut that was the Wehrmacht. Further, for Hitler, the defeat of the Red Army was tantamount to victory because Soviet political system would surely collapse as soon as the army was defeated. Thus, the decision to attack to the east. The National Socialists had two war aims for the east: race and space, plus the added benefit of continuing the campaign against the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. Racial purity was, of course, a driving motivation for the Hitler regime, and next to the Jews and the Roma, the Slavic peoples of the USSR occupied a very low position in the racial construct of the Nazi narrative. The war on the Eastern Front was, in many ways, a racial war. Hitler declared that the war in the East would be a war of extermination, a position that essentially negated the accepted laws of land warfare. For Hitler, subhumans were not entitled to the protections offered by the Conventions of Geneva or The Hague. All bets were off. It is worth noting that as a direct result of the Nazi stance toward Soviet troops, over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war would die while in German captivity. The Slavic Untermensch paid a very steep price at the hands of the Wehrmacht. A second priority was space, Lebensraum, living room. The National Socialist program required space. It needed space for expansion, for food, for agricultural settlement by ethnic Germans, and for natural resources in order to realize the dream of the expanded thousand-year Reich and sustained continental hegemony. The attack to the east provided that space, ample food, at least for the Germans, critical petroleum supplies, and a ready supply of slave labor. Thus, planning begins at Hitler's order in 1940 for a 1941 attack. The context of Barbarossa for the Holocaust, then, is initial territorial success followed by unachieved operational objectives and a failed theater strategy because the Soviet Union did not collapse. The crucial point here is that the military failure notwithstanding, the regime never lost its anti-Jewish focus, and the war against the Jews accelerated dramatically despite the military slowing, followed by military stoppage, followed by military retreat. The persecution of the Jews accelerated. Concomitant to the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, National Socialist policy vis-a-vis the Jews shifted from one of removal to planned extermination. This represents the turning point in the Holocaust. All emigration was halted as the Nazis sought to capture and annihilate as many as possible. Germans of mixed blood, previously exempted from targeting, the Mischlinge, were no longer protected and were included in the population targeted for extermination. Decorated Jewish veterans of the First World War, previously exempt from persecution, were also no longer protected. Nazi policies on the Eastern Front enabled the pursuit of specified populations with impunity, with Jews as the primary focus. Among the mechanisms employed to eliminate Jews was the so-called Barbarossa Decree, or the Jurisdiction Order. It was issued in May of 1941 in preparation for the attack. The order declared that the war against the Russians was a war of extermination. It was a racial war, and the Judeo-Bolshevik menace could be eliminated only through total annihilation. Further, the order made clear that all Jews, construed by many to mean men, women, and children, were part of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy and were thus classified as partisans. The order also directed that all partisans were a threat to the Reich and were not to be afforded the due process of a military court. They could be summarily executed on the order of any Wehrmacht or SS officer. This marks yet another escalation. A related order, the Commissar Order, identified political officers who were organic to Soviet formations as key parts of the Judeo-Bolshevik threat, who were to be summarily executed. Many German officers assumed, based on information from Berlin, that all political officers were Jews. Other policies designed to eliminate or expend the population of occupied territories included the Hunger Plan, which intended to denude Soviet agricultural areas in order to feed German troops, a plan that cavalierly assumed the intentional starvation of the Slavs who lived in those areas. This was acceptable to the Nazis because for the National Socialists, Slavs, like Jews, represented lives unworthy of life. Forced labor was another Nazi methodology that used human capital as an expendable resource. And we have already mentioned the 3 million Soviet POWs who died in German captivity as a result of starvation and exposure. The 2 million Jews killed in the first year of Operation Barbarossa represented a sea change in the Nazi approach to the Jewish problem. While many segments of the population in the Nazi-occupied territories were subject to abuse and persecution, it was only the Jews of Europe who were singularly targeted for complete extermination, another indication of the turning point. The mass killing occurred in two overlapping phases. The first phase is the Einsatzgruppen period beginning in June of 1941 that predates the Wannsee Conference, which we will discuss shortly. The second phase was the operation of killing centers, sometimes more commonly called extermination camps, which began in earnest a year later in the spring of 1942. The killing centers were far different from the concentration camps that have been employed by the Nazis thus far. They had only one business: mass murder. In the first phase, the Einsatzgruppen were deployed across the vast territories overrun by the Wehrmacht. In the wake of the army, they identified, captured, and murdered over 1.3 million Jews, primarily using bullets and gas fans. In one day alone, actually about 36 hours, more than 33,000 men, women, and children from Kiev were executed and buried in a ravine at Babi Yar. Similar, albeit lesser events occurred across the occupied territories. This was murder on a scale unheard of prior to the invasion of the USSR. Yet despite the huge number of killed, there was dissatisfaction in Berlin with the speed and expense of the murders. It required too many bullets, it took too many men, and took too great a toll on the men pulling the triggers. The dissatisfaction grew more acute as the progress of the invasion into the USSR began to falter. The status quo would not solve the Jewish problem. That was the issue that Reinhard Heydrich attempted to tackle at a spacious mansion in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee in January of 1942. Heydrich realized that the goal of extermination could not be realized without a more efficient murder mechanism, and he assembled a group of involved officials, including representatives of government ministries, legal organs, the SS, and Nazi party leaders with regional equities in the East. Coming into the meeting, it was Heydrich's charter to solve the Jewish problem. At Wannsee, he used influence and coercion to exact from the group their commitment to support and participate in the final solution to the Jewish question. At Wannsee, the annihilation of the European Jews became Nazi policy. It is important to note that there is no extant document or other record that demonstrate Hitler's direct involvement in the meeting. There is, as Ian Kershaw has characterized it, no smoking gun. However, again from Ian Kershaw, there is an abundant evidence that the assembled group was, quote, working toward the Führer, end of quote, that is, striving to achieve Hitler's intent as they understood it. The business of killing, as we have seen, did not wait for Wannsee, but in the conference aftermath, the complexion of the East changed again dramatically. Here you see a snapshot of the Nazi camps in the region, and there are many. Most were intended primarily for incarceration. However brutally that was accomplished. Here is a more telling map. This one identifies the ghettos into which the Jewish populations were sequestered. They are represented by the yellow stars on the red discs. Significantly, the map identifies 6 killing centers: Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. These are identified by the skull and crossbone symbols. Unlike the concentration and labor camps, the killing centers had only one purpose, and that was mass killing. Of the 6 killing centers, 3 had a special identification as Operation Reinhard camps. Those camps were named for Reinhard Heydrich, who had been assassinated in Prague 5 months after the Wannsee Conference. Those 3 camps are Treblinka in the upper left, Sobibor, upper right, and Belzec, seen at the lower left. These camps existed for only one purpose: for killing, and each was located near large ghettos. As trains would arrive, the human cargo was offloaded and sent immediately or nearly immediately to the gas chambers. It is interesting to note that most of these camps had barracks only for the prisoners required for labor. There was no requirement for barracks in many of these locations because the prisoners went immediately to their deaths. The fourth camp on the chart, Kelno, seen at the lower right, was not officially an Operation Reinhard camp because it predated the other three actually beginning construction in December of 41. But it was also a purpose-built killing center that operated contemporaneously with the other three and is frequently included among the Reinhard camps for the discussion of as a killing center. These camps represent the shift in effort, another turning point that followed first Barbarossa and second Wannsee. In October of 1943, all of these camps were closed, but only after an additional 1.5 to 2 million Jews had been killed. It is worthy of note in the autumn of 1943, between the Einsatzgruppen and the killing centers, 3.5 million of Europe's Jews were already dead. It is also worth noting that in late 1943, the SS was working feverishly to deconstruct the camps to hide their purpose. The other camps listed earlier, Majdanek and Auschwitz, were not exclusively established for extermination, but were actually multi-purpose camps. In the interest of time and because of its notoriety, I will focus on Auschwitz. Auschwitz is actually a complex of 3 main camps, Auschwitz 1, 2, and 3, as well as some 48 subcamps. Here you can see the 3 main camps in yellow from the left, Auschwitz 2, Birkenau, and then in the center, the small yellow block is Auschwitz 1, and then to the right, Auschwitz 3, Bunamanowitz. Auschwitz I was the original and the main camp. It was established in 1940 in an abandoned Polish military facility and housed the administrative and command offices of the entire Auschwitz complex. It had first functioned under the Nazis as a concentration camp for political prisoners and had become a combination concentration and extermination camp in 1941. Auschwitz III, Bunamanowitz, was an IG Farben industrial complex, which was attempting to make synthetic rubber. Farben leveraged slave labor from Auschwitz to man this camp, and over 40,000 of those slave laborers died in the failed attempt to operate the factory. Auschwitz II Birkenau is the Auschwitz we hear about. The selection of the name Birkenau, birch forest, brings to mind something that leaves me thinking that the selection of the name was particularly sardonic. It is purpose-built killing center with gas chambers and crematoria so large and efficient that their production often exceeded processing capacity. The camp staff was frequently overwhelmed by the volume of death they caused. Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Majdanek represent the zenith of the National Socialist extermination campaign against the Jews in Europe, but they are only part of the machinery of the Holocaust. My goal today was to demonstrate that the Holocaust, which arguably spanned 12 years from 33 to 45, was a catastrophe that steadily intensified from 43 to 41. After the onset of Barbarossa in 1941, however, the Holocaust came to full flower, and National Socialist regime was no longer committed to removing the Jews. It was dedicated entirely to their destruction. It was the turning point of the Holocaust, as well as the launch proper of the Holocaust. Our technical expert, Zach, has a means to field questions, but before I switch to him, I want to remind everybody to please remember that Dr. John Hostler is going to engage us on Barbarossa, but in an entirely different context next month, the 1167 Siege of Rome. Please join us for that. And I'll pause now to see if there are any questions. I've just gotten a question about whether and when did the Allies know about the final solution? This is a matter of some consternation among scholars. There is evidence that as early as late 1942, there was enough proof to indicate that the mass killing was going on in a planned and organized manner. It began appearing in newspapers in late 1942 and throughout 1943, generally not front page news, generally several pages inside the newspaper. But by late 1943, it was absolutely a documentable event, uh, and more news came out over the years. There's a large debate about bombing of Auschwitz as well, that talks to what the Allies knew and when they knew it. Based on what I'm hearing from Zach, that's all the questions we have. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my pleasure to do this. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this in a remote setting. And I know it was an awful lot of information. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. And I think that it's going to wrap it up for us. Thank you very much for your attention.